How's everyone doing? We'll give people just a minute to get here. I was fighting with a lamp, so I'm running about a minute behind it today, but I think everything's going to be all right. Well, you tell me.
Yeah.
Is that very good? Is that perfect? How exciting!
Captions are auto-generated.
Oh, good. Captions are auto-generated. We had a few people. So that's good. We're good. Hope everyone's having a good Friday. I'm Maria Castley. I'm the chief archivist and tours manager at City Museum. This is my husband, Max Castley. He owns Beatnik Bob's.
With her.
With me. Also that. So, hi Nancy. Let's see. So, what we've been doing, for those of you joining us, what we've been doing on Fridays is I've been going through during the week a lot of archival material from the City Museum. And on Fridays, I've been sharing you guys some of the things that we found. I was trying to figure out try and put together a bit of a theme today and for today's show. And one of the things I was thinking about is I've been going through a lot of newspapers lately. So kind of putting the City Museum in perspective of like what newspapers were saying at the time. So for this episode, we're going to focus on Bob Castley's early life, and then a little bit, and then going into right before the museum a few years before the museum started, and then kind of right after it opened. So a little background for those that you may not know. Bob Castley was a sculptor in St. Louis. He was brought up in Webster Groves County, right outside of the city, and he and his wife Gail Castley opened City Museum. So they were the co-founders. Bob started, I think he was he was a formal training as a sculptor, and he went to Fonfon. He was one of the first male graduates of that, a previously all women's college. So yeah, we'll get into. Hi, Bridget. All right, and if you guys have any questions during the slideshow, definitely just put them in the comments, and I will do my best to respond to them. Okay, so let's switch over to the desktop, and we'll get started. Okay. Hi, Kim. This is a super young photo of Bob. It's one of the youngest ones that we have. I also want to thank Daisy Castley for lending me this material so we could share it with you guys. I'm going to go through, and we're working on setting up a more formal way to document these besides with my cell phone. So, but for right now, I think it works. Yay, Kim! This was a photo of Bob that we found from, I believe it was 1965. He was in sophomore in high school, I believe, at Vianney High School, a local private high school in St. Louis. And he won an honorable mention for his sculpture of the Madonna and Child. One of the things I wanted to point out here is Castley started in a pretty traditional sense to get training as a sculptor. He started while he was in high school working with Rudy Turini. And one of the things that I wanted to point out that was in this article was Rudy said of him that he is an extremely quiet, highly motivated, and remarkable boy. He has talent and invests his time and energy, almost all of his free time. I have had more talented students, but not more motivated ones. And I definitely think that drive and that personality is one of the reasons why the City Museum exists, because he had that type of drive. Hi, mom. My mom's watching. It's another young photo of Bob. It's from the '60s, I believe. This is a little bit older photo. This is of him working on a sculpture. No, this is getting a little bit later in his. This was in his 30s, where he, like at the first line, it said, at the relatively youthful age of 33, Robert J. Castley has gone through more careers than the average 65-year-old. Um, yeah, apparently he had tried to do a restaurant, and that didn't end up working out. And he had worked in building rehab, which kind of segued into his time as this where he was in here, where they started. He and Gail started Castley and Castley. It was a architectural sculpture company where they would do a lot of work around the St. Louis area, rebuilding the facades of different historical buildings and adding sculptures and to them. One of the things that we watched a movie, which we will be airing at 7 p.m. tonight. Max has been my husband and Bob's son has been working on the footage, and it's an interview from about this time that this article was published. And it kind of he talks about how one of the reasons why he likes working in architecture so much is because of the scale that it allows you to work on. Let's see. So this is a little later. This is 91. Bob was working. Praying Mantis was originally can't think of the word. Commissioned. Thank you. The Praying Mantis was originally commissioned by the zoo, but then they decided that it would be too much of a hazard. People would be trying to climb on it, as you can see, happens quite a bit by Bob. The other story I heard about that is that they originally wanted it a certain size, and then he built it 20 times higher than and bigger, larger than they wanted. Talking back to scale, and they decided they didn't want it, so he decided to just go ahead and finish it anyway, and then kept it for himself. It had a couple different lives and different homes. It was on top of the Castley and Castley headquarters for a little while on the roof. Then it went to the botanical gardens. It ended up getting brought back to the City Museum. When that opened, it was on top of the entrance awning, and then big windstorm ended up getting knocked off there. So then they moved it up to the roof, and it is now in its current home, and probably the longest it's ever been in one place, up on top of the dome on the rooftop. This is another one. This was before City Museum. These were hippos that Bob worked on, and these ended up going up to Hippo Park in Central Park in New York City. These sculptures, the original ones, were recently, within the last couple of years, sent back to City Museum. They took casts of them, and they were getting damaged with weather and all that kind of stuff. And people playing on them, as they should. So they sent the original. They took casts of them, cast them in some stronger material, and they're still there. They sent the original ones back to us. They asked us if we wanted them, and I mean, of course, why wouldn't you? This was a '94 article in St. Louis Magazine. This was the year after they had bought the building for the museum. The museum wouldn't actually be open for another 3 years in 1997. He's currently working. This photo shows him working on one of the pieces that is outside of the City Museum building. This one, you can see the serpent fence. That was the first major installation that they built for the museum in general. The whale was the first one inside the city, inside the building. But before they started, essentially before they started anything else, they built the serpent fence so they could kind of claim their territory, and so people could know know that something crazy was going on inside the building. Ricky, who still works on the crew at the city museum, he's the one that's working on the serpent fence. And then you can see the sculpture on the right, the bottom right. That's Daisy Castley, Bob's daughter. That he had done a sculpture of her and ended up casting it in one of the sculptures is up above the clock that was outside of on Washington Avenue. That has since been moved to in front of the City Museum. And we have more hippos. These actually were heading out of St. Louis, and they were going to Busch Gardens in Florida. And he also has some hippos in the St. Louis Zoo as well.
Actually, there's a funny story. My dad was at the zoo watching the hippos and making his mold, or his he would use like live he would use live models a lot of times. Yeah, and so he got the zoo to let him in to the hippo area, and he was setting it up there, and the hippo got annoyed by him definitely by the end, and he was just where you could stand, and the zoo was just completely closed, and the hippo pooped all over him and everything that because he was pretty close to the cage, and yeah.
That's why you don't get close to hippos at the zoo.
Yeah. So you're welcome.
Yeah. So let's see, that's really funny. So one of the things that I thought was really important, that I think is important to understanding the history of the museum and kind of how it got there, was the state of downtown St. Louis at the time was pretty bleak. I won't say there wasn't anything down there, but I mean, it was pretty much just like, it seemed to pretty much only be like baseball games, and then, you go see the arch, and then you would leave. Like there weren't a whole lot of businesses down there. So one of the plans was to buy these two buildings that were originally the International Shoe Company. It was their offices, and then their shipping, their warehouse. So the plan was to buy, like they call them city junkies, the Castleys, was to help transform old buildings into a museum with offices, which museum was the original like working title for City Museum. It ended up being changed to City Museum, which I think was probably wise. This one, it was an article in the Wall Street Journal that was talking about how this would be a new reason to bring people downtown. One of the highlights of this one is a woman from St. Charles was talking about how she suggested getting a really well-lighted parking lot, and saying that a lot of people might not feel comfortable downtown because of the crime rate at the time. And Bob's retort was, we'll get the people who aren't afraid. So there wasn't ever like a huge concern with public outreach, I wouldn't say. Bob and his crew, and Bob and Gail, they kind of just wanted to build something that they thought was interesting, and then hopefully draw people in. People would come. It shows these guys just because it kind of drove home the point that downtown has some symbolic value. So bringing people downtown was really important to the city. And yeah, I like that in the top right-hand corner, Castley admits that public service is not the primary reason behind the new museum. He's really just doing it for the hell of it, which seems on brand for that family. Yeah, talking about, so the downtown has some symbolic value, that the St. Louis didn't necessarily need just like a sterile downtown that looks like something more in a postcard. So that why it was really important that creative solutions were brought. They had kind of tried some things with the St. Louis with the Gateway Mall, and that hadn't really worked out. So some of like the more traditional plans for revitalizing a downtown didn't really work for us as well, for various reasons. So why not try something new? And City Museum definitely fit the bill for that. Yeah. And the other part that I wanted to bring up too is that it didn't that at the time, especially when it first started, City Museum was privately funded by the Castleys. So it later ended up getting turned into a nonprofit for a short time, but that was part of one of the reasons why they were able to kind of do what they wanted, which was so important to the City Museum turning into what it was, is that it was self-funded. So that way, uh, they could do what they wanted without having to worry about board approval and city funding. They were just able to create on their own terms, which was really important, and it's still important. This article was kind of more of a tongue-in-cheek article, the stuff and nonsense at City Museum. I like that they called them the perpetrators of the multiple outrages under the warehouse rafters are a duet of artist revolutionaries who call themselves Bob and Gail Castley. So this next one, it's the shapeshifter, talking about how art and business. I really liked how art and business are so important, and one of the things that I kind of, as I was going through these, that struck me was how impressive it was with whatever problems downtown St. Louis has. How impressive the city was that people were able to make their livings as artists, and I don't think that's as possible in perhaps in other cities. So it was just really encouraging, and if you have the drive, seeing what options were available to you in downtown St. Louis. The photo down in the front, yeah, the whale was one of the first major installations that was built inside City Museum. The original vision for the museum, based on the articles anyway, was that it was supposed to be sort of an artist complex with a lot of different businesses and art studios in between the two buildings. In the years since they had bought them, the Last Hotel now owns one of the front-facing buildings on Washington, and then obviously we're still in the building that's behind it. But that had kept up for a while, there are still other businesses within City Museum within the building. So that, let's see. Oh, hi Donna. The other part that you saw as a theme going through the museum was architectural salvage. So that goes back to the Castley's connection with Kathleen Castley, the architectural sculpture. But then also St. Louis had kind of a bad habit of letting like historical buildings go and then ended up tearing them down rather than putting the money in to rehab them. And I think for a while it kind of made more financial sense to just tear a building down, which is where we ended up getting a lot of the materials from. They would call Bob and call the Castleys and be like, "Hey, do you want to come? Like, this building's getting torn down. Are you interested?" And the answer would, of course, be yes. And even if it wasn't something that we would use right away, we would end up using it down the line. And that's still a sort of a policy of the City Museum at this point, that we wouldn't take something from a building that was going to stay up or that could be saved, but if it was going to be torn down, it was fair game, and why not turn it into give it a new home and a new context and like a whole new installation. This was right before, well, yeah, 1 month before the museum opened. This was an article about what was coming. Uh, I always loved this, and well, loved and also just makes me so nervous seeing Bob on top of the Bob on top of the water towers, which have eventually, when they opened the roof, painted those red, added some more slides, as you do. Uh, we Max and I have been working on a driving tour, which we'll talk about a little bit more at the 7 o'clock show, of Bob's and his crew's work around St. Louis, and we've titled the tour Castle City just because I think it's a fantastic name. Plus, it draws attention to all the work that he has out around St. Louis. This was right after the museum opened. This photo's quite a bit different. There's some things that are the same, but it's quite a bit different from what it looks like now. You can see the giant dinosaur that was on loan for an exhibit that was to the right, where the monster slide is now, which I just went down today, actually. So yeah, this is a view down the main staircase to the museum. This was the week that it opened. And this was jumping forward about a year later. The museum, right when it opened, the attendance wasn't as high, and then as people heard about it and heard about how like fantastic it was, people started coming. For a long time, the museum didn't have a marketing department. It was just essentially word of mouth, and we did pretty well like that for a while. We are happily have one now, but that's yeah, we didn't for a long time, which was just always so crazy to me. But yeah, the museum offerings impress visiting experts. They have drawn, at the time of this, which was in February, they had more than 70,000 visitors. So clearly, people weren't too afraid to come to St. Louis. At least some people come downtown. This is a question that has gotten asked, I think, since we opened and continues to get asked. That some people come expecting galleries, and we do have those, but primarily we are an interactive art installation is the way I like to think about it. So yeah, the idea that the museum's also a playground, I think, is something that has been continuous throughout our entire life. Yeah, and this was another one that was in the fall, so the museum had been open just a year. But this, well, the old photo, there was a little Art City. There was a little gallery space back behind the dinosaur. This was also, yeah, before the 3-story, the monster slide got in there. And it does, I liked this article, one, because it showed Bob's favorite phrase is, anything can be a brick if you have enough of it, which definitely goes through the museum. And also it has a quote from Gale that said, nearly everything in the world has the potential to stimulate the mind and challenge one to think creatively. If I could read today. So yeah, creating a wonderland from other people's trash is very, very on brand with the museum, and the way that it was made, partly because one, since it was self-funded, which was important for creativity, but also put a lot of limits on budgets, that a lot of people's trash and donated items and materials ended up being the building blocks for City Museum. And then this last one is just more and more and more. This was a quote from Gale where they were just going to continue building, and that's something that we've taken to heart and continue to do. Some of the same people that have started it originally. Unfortunately, Bob is no longer with us, but the museum just keeps building and expanding and growing, which I think is important. Let's see. So, I think that does it for us, for me. I really appreciate you guys hanging in there and going through some of the articles. I think it's really interesting to see how the city kind of viewed the museum. A lot of people didn't think it was going to make it. Other people were just 100% behind it. We're like really excited to see what would happen. And in spite of everything, over 20 years later, we're still here, which is, I think, really impressive for a museum of its type, which I guess is pretty unique. But yeah. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate you watching. We've got a show coming up. Back